Welcome to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and their journey. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I am the co-host of this show, and if you check out some of our archives, we've got some great interviews with smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all kinds of companies. I'm also the co-founder of the company Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects using done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And this episode is brought to you by EO San Francisco. EO San Francisco is the local Bay Area chapter of Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a global peer-to-peer network of more than 20,000 influential business owners across 200 chapters, 60 plus countries. And if you are the founder, co-founder, owner, or controlling shareholder of a company that generates over $1 million a year in revenues, and you want to connect with other like-minded successful entrepreneurs, EO is for you. And the EO San Francisco chapter enables leading entrepreneurs in the Bay Area to learn, grow, and achieve greater success. And you can learn more at eosf.org. All right. And my guest here today is Jon Bunten. Am I saying that right, Jon? Jon Bunten?
That's right, John.
Cool. Jon is the CEO and co-founder of RecorGroup, which is a full-service boutique brokerage agency specializing in connecting consumer goods manufacturers with retailers. He's got a lot of crazy stories here, not the least of which is the fact that he met his wife, Shama, who I know through EO San Francisco, while I was present. I was there when they met each other at an EO event. And so we're going to hear about that in a moment or two. But first, Jon, I always love asking people about what they were like as a kid. And you grew up in a farm in Idaho, and very different experience for me because I grew up in the suburbs. But tell me a little bit about what that upbringing was like.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be with you, John. Really excited for this interview. Growing up, I was the oldest of three, so I have a brother and sister. I grew up in a rural farming life, and my parents were very poor growing up, and my dad was a construction laborer and ultimately was able to save enough money to purchase our farm. And so we grew up farming, and which is really hard work. So I grew up as a pretty serious kid.
Yeah, because you were the oldest, and you were taking care of the younger ones.
Yeah.
And there was abuse in the home.
Yeah. So, once my parents divorced, it placed us in a tough spot. My mom was, we really became, we went to live with my mom, and my dad was pretty well out of the picture at that point. And so I grew up really with a single mom. And as a result of that, she didn't have a lot of great skills. She had to go to work in a grocery store. And so we ended up being placed in some kind of dangerous positions that were somewhat, basically became abusive situations. And so I ended up leaving home when I was 15 and actually going to live with another friend's parents through graduation of high school.
And what was that like for you? You had a friend, I guess, who's that's hard in the family to bring you in. It's hard for you. What was that experience like the last few years of high school? There must have been, I think like shame, to admit it to your classmates. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was tough. It was tough to be, to separate from my siblings too. When I left, it was really this feeling of self-preservation that I had. And so I carry a lot of guilt with me actually into adulthood of leaving my brother and sister behind. But at the time, it was self-preservation mode, and I ended up creating this feeling inside of me when I was 15 and I had this mantra that I would say to myself and the mantra really was, if it's meant to be, it's up to me. And that really fueled my life well into my mid-30s, was this idea of like, I'm on my own, and if I'm going to be a successful human being, then it's up to me to drive forward and to create that success in my life.
You end up at 17 entering the military, which, of course, a lot of people historically have done when they don't have other options or they don't have resources to pay for a college education. My grandfather was in the Air Force, and my father was in the Air Force, and I was raised with a lot of respect for those who spend time in the military, and also what it does for people, because it gives you a path upward. It gives you, an opportunity to create growth for yourself. So talk a little bit about what that was like for you.
Yeah, the military was incredible for me. The Army was really good to me. I, entered in, as you said, when I was 17, really not knowing what I wanted to do with my life. My parents weren't in a position to send me to school. My dad was actively opposed to me going to college, and so I didn't really know what
That's
I
gotta
wanted.
mess with your head because what was that like?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It was confusing, and I think for me, it fueled me further. Like the kind of the adage, when somebody tells you no, you kind of want to do something more. So
Yeah.
when I was 17, like I really was a fairly serious kid, and I was academically a high achiever. And so I knew I wanted to do something with my life. I just didn't know how yet to do it. So when I entered the military, it was such an interesting place for me. Growing up on a farm in Idaho, it really, lacked any diversity. So we grew up, 99.9%, white rural folks. And so going to Fort Benning in Georgia for my basic training and being around people from all walks of life and all sorts of other countries as well. We were also part of an exchange program with the Korean Rock Army, the Egyptian Army. So I met
Wow.
so many cool people through that. And it really spurred this love of continuous learning, leadership, and education and connection. And I think for me, the Army was such a great place to form connection. Like to this day, when I meet other people that are in the military, like we can form like really fast bonds just because it's we've had those shared levels of experience. But for me, yeah, the Army really taught me leadership, and at a young age. So I was active those first couple of years. Did my medic training. I ended up going to medic school. Had some officers, really wonderful mentors. Two in particular that I thought just at the time were just the most grown up, most like ideal like leaders. And
They were probably 19 or something like that, looking back
looking
on it,
back on it,
right?
these were guys that were like 24 years old that were
Yeah.
second lieutenants. And but they told me like, John, you don't belong as an enlisted soldier. You got to go get a college degree and become an officer. And so they helped me get a scholarship. I ended up with full scholarship to school through the ROTC and commissioned into the reserves. I spent 14 years as an officer. I was a finance officer, finance and contracting officer. Did some time in Germany with doing contracting, and then ultimately I ended up, as a civilian, progressing in the military, and ended up as a small hospital company commander. And then when I started my first or my second company, RecorGroup, I knew that it was going to be too difficult to continue to be an officer, so I resigned my commission.
Yeah. And I'm curious about this. The military tends to be, in some ways, your life is laid out for you. Like if you are moved, if your company is moved, the military takes care of everything for your move. In
That's right.
entrepreneurship, you have to figure stuff out. So in some ways, it's very different. And there isn't this set of rules. There isn't this hierarchy like there is in the military. But on the other hand, the discipline that military life can teach you can be really helpful in the world of entrepreneurship. Just reflect a little bit on some of those ways in which your background in the military was relevant in the world of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's a really great question. For me, the military was so helpful in providing structure and discipline to me and like helping me think in different ways. And also to be able to develop muscle memory around the development of processes and systems. So, in the military, one of the greatest things that the military does is really ingrain training into people. And so it becomes like a pilot where you're trained so well that when something happens, you don't have to think about it anymore. It's a muscle memory. And so in that perspective, that's helped to translate things over for me in terms of business to create systems and processes and efficiencies and train on them, do rehearsals and things of that nature that make it to where business operates, that people are clear on their accountabilities, the structure is clear, processes are clear. And then also from the officer lens, they did teach us to think very creatively about problem solving. Yes, there were specific kind of sets of decisions that were like, if X happens, then you should consider this. But a lot of the times it was very creative decision-making process. So for me, the military was helpful in instilling discipline, but also helping me to think creatively and also put around, there's a process in the military called military decision-making process to put very delineated thought into terms of how we make decisions. And so that was also helpful to me.
You joined the Army in, was it 2001?
Yes.
Right before 9/11.
Correct. Yep.
What was that like being active duty in the Army at the time of 9/11? What was going through your head at that time?
Yeah, John, I've talked to some people about this recently, during that period of 9/11 and the years after, it was, I think, one of the last times that this country was really, it felt like it was really together. And it was, there was, no matter what your political affiliation or leaning, it was a time where people were coming together to support each other. And so for me, it was, as a young man, there was a lot of patriotism that was happening at that time, especially within the branches of the service. The military itself is the bulk of the fighting forces are made up of kids from 18 to 23. And so it was a motivational time period. But I also feel like on the macro sense, it was a time that people were thinking about how do we behave as a society together as Americans. And I felt a lot of pride at that time to be a member of the military and to be an American.
Yeah. There's a lot of kind of different turns in your story here. As you said, you were a medic and you ran a hospital company in the Army. So naturally, your next step after that is running sales for Smuckers. How did that happen? How did you end up going in that direction?
Well, when I was a finance officer, when I was in New York, I started my career right out of college. I got recruited through a group at the time was called Students in Free Enterprise, and so I was the president of the Students in Free Enterprise at my college. And in that program, you would put together different events and that would help the community really understand the tenets of free market economics. And so once you did this through the year, you would put together these annual reports, and then you go to these competitions around the country and present them. And so I ended up for the last 2 years of my college really going to these events, and then where they would have recruiters that were all Fortune 500, C-suite executives that would be at these conferences, and we would furnish these lists of our short bios, headshots. And if people liked how you spoke and liked your messaging, like they'd circle your headshot and they'd come find you afterwards. And so I ended up with a couple of job offers right before I graduated. The first one was with a company called Dell Labs, which was in New York. They provide 6 months before I graduated. I ended up accepting their offer to go into finance. And they gave me a full moving package to New York. I was super stoked and excited. And so I ended up going to work for Dell, really working in finance at the time. And
is this not related to Michael Dell, the computer company, or
a different Dell Labs? Yeah,
okay.
It was a beauty company. And we made all sorts of nail clippers and nail polishes and all sorts of kind of niche items. I went to work in finance for them initially, but I had a knack for telling stories with numbers. And so I ended up pioneering a trade marketing group within that kind of a sales finance group. And then I got recruited, or actually we got purchased by a larger entity called Coty, which is a gigantic fragrance and cosmetics producer, also that's based in the US and New York. Ended up working for them and then recruited by Smuckers. And then I ended up moving to Cleveland and taking a role within the sales finance trade marketing group there.
And that eventually led to you starting Recor, and you saw an opportunity where a need wasn't being met in the marketplace. So take us through that.
Yeah. So at Smuckers, our sales team was represented by a sales broker. So brokerage companies, they represent brands like Smuckers, and then they'll act as the outsourced sales and marketing team for that company, and they'll make the calls on retailers. So I was managing the grocery side of the business, and so calling on big grocery chains like Albertsons, Safeway, Winco, places like that. So I was managing out in the West, and ended up seeing this huge gaping opportunity from the company that we were working with, which is a large company. They're around $5 billion in sales. As a company, we were paying them tens of millions of dollars in brokerage and not getting what we needed. It was like pulling teeth to get what we needed, even though we were in their, top 5 clients. So I saw this huge opportunity to do things differently. And those companies really are really the same playbook for all the big guys, the big brokerage companies. They're all debt levered and owned by private equity, and have been levered and flipped multiple times. So every time that happened, more skin would come off the bone. And really, at the end of the day, these are people businesses, and so the expenses you end up cutting are people. So what we continued to see was as these companies grow and they continued to get debt levered and flipped, there was just an inability to serve at the ground floor. And so I saw this as an opportunity. Myself and my co-founder, Mark, we saw a huge opportunity to do it differently, to prioritize white glove service, and to really create and build a company that people want to work for, that they loved being a part of, that had a broader mission to it. And that, number one, we served our client to the very best of our ability. And so that's what we set out to create almost 11 years ago. And we kept continue to grow year over year, double digits. We're looking at transformational growth in the next 3 to 7 years, continue to expand beyond our geographical boundaries, and enhancing and growing our customer base.
Now, the last time you mentioned geography, you mentioned Cleveland. How did you end up back in Idaho, where you're from?
Yeah. So when I was with Smuckers, I was working in the sales finance group, had an opportunity to take over the West region, and ended up moving out to Idaho, really because at the time I was traveling about 40 weeks a year, and they really didn't care where I was going to be based at. So I was from Idaho originally, and my ex-wife and I were getting ready to start a family, and so it just made sense for us to relocate there.
And what was it like for you? You mentioned, growing up in this abusive home. Some people don't want to go back to where they're from.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. At the time, I think I had made a lot of peace with my past, and had really found a place of peace and forgiveness in my life, and was excited to get back home to Idaho. Had lived in a number of places and around the country, and at that time was ready to go to a little more quiet place with great cost of living and great quality of life, and so that we found ourselves back there.
I spent some time last summer went through Boise and then McCall, Idaho, beautiful area. And
That's gorgeous.
Idaho has, I never went there until around COVID, actually, for the first time. And it's a great place.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, as I get older, the more I realize that everyone's carrying something, a burden. So many people have suffered various different traumas in their lives. For you mentioned, getting past this previous, abusive home that you built, that you grew up in. What were some things that you did, and what would you advise for others to help them get through some rough upbringing like that?
Yeah, I think for me, going through my divorce, almost 6 years ago now, was actually the most devastating point of my life. It was a place that I got to as an adult man who thought he had everything, and really came to a realization that I was really unhappy in my life. On the surface, I had everything that I ever wanted. And I remember I was on a bike packing trip, and just had, it's like 3 days into my trip. I was in Montana, and I remember staring up at the sky and having this overwhelming sense come over me of, you have everything you want, but you have a big gaping hole inside of you right now.
Mm.
And I remember coming back from that and feeling really unhappy in my marriage. And I remember sharing that with my ex-wife, and I took her to dinner and shared with her, I'm feeling really unhappy. I'd like to, prioritize us and work on our marriage. And I just remember she told me, she said, and I'll never forget, she said, that sounds like a you problem and you should figure that out. And so to your earlier question, that's really launched me into deep self-work. So I spent another 2 years really in therapy, in all sorts of retreats, technologies, biohacking, to really come to a place of understanding that it wasn't just a me problem, it was a we problem. And in that process, though, it helped me really get clear about the things that I wanted out of my life. I developed a deep meditation practice. I really became, going through my divorce was the lowest point of my life. It was a point where I felt like it was the bottom. Like I didn't think that there was a coming back from it, from that.
Mm.
Was
And you have 3 kids, right? That
Yeah,
I'm sure that had a big role to
yeah,
play in it. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So it was a point where my identity was rocked. I felt that, um, yeah, to your point with my kids, I had, always been around with them or around them, and it was just a very difficult time. So, but what it did do was it created a space of humility for me to really recognize and to come to a place of really letting go. Like it was a point in my life that I realized, what I shared with you before, that I had this mantra that if it was up to me, if it's meant to be, it's up to me, wasn't working for me anymore. This
Mm.
this life of forceful doing and making willing things into existence wasn't working for me. And so it was in this like letting go and trusting that the universe had my back and that all was going to be well was where I found peace. And once I hit that place, it was a transformational time period for me, and continues to persist in my own self-actualization and the things that my wife and I do, my current wife and I do today. Our practices around self-care, reflection, meditation are really crucial for us.
You also joined Entrepreneurs Organization, looks like in 2018. What role did EO play for you as you're going through these struggles?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. EO for me at the time that I joined, I remember going to an EO meeting, and the president of the Idaho chapter at the time, Joel Flake, he said, I remember him saying in the intro, if you feel overwhelmed and stressed out and like you can't add one single additional thing to your plate, then this is the right group for you. And I remember thinking, okay, well, you know what? That's an interesting way to frame that. And he was right. What it did do was it helped me connect with a group of folks that helped me transform my thinking around business and helped me to find resources and think about resourcing in a different way. Led me down the path of scaling up and then to EOS in our subsequent years, that really helped me create a really delineated framework for our business that's allowed us to scale and to grow, and for me to really step out a lot of the day-to-day of our business. So for me, it was probably one of the best business decisions I ever made.
All
And
right,
on the personal side,
yeah, no, I want to get to that. So 2022, you head to a conference in Huntington Beach, and
yeah,
I was privileged to be there. I don't think I've ever been there another time where 2 people met and then got married. And it was a fun evening. We were all out having fun. I was staying in a house with your now wife, Shama, and a bunch of other San Francisco members. And there was this guy, John. This is my side of the story now, but then I want to hear your side of the story. But there's this guy, John, who we met from Idaho, who just kept on hanging around. And
yeah,
and
yeah.
and then I remember hearing from Shama a week later that you guys had been on phone basically every day for a week. But so tell me your side of the story. What was that like?
Yeah, sure. It was really wonderful. Ended up going to the Alchemy event in Huntington Beach. Was not expecting to find my soulmate at that conference. And in fact, I had really I was at a place where I was not looking at all, and sat down at the table the first night, and Shama was 2 seats over, and her and another woman, Stephanie from the Seattle chapter, were engaged in a conversation around spirituality and business, and it piqued my interest. And I injected myself in the conversation, and we just ended up having this great dialogue. And she asked me at one point, she asked me some couple of distinct questions. One of them, which was, what content are you consuming right now? And if you know Shama, that's a great question that she likes to ask. But she asked that question, and so she kind of gained insight into what I was reading. And then she asked me the question, "Who are you?" And I knew the question that she was actually really asking me. And so I responded to her, and I said, "I'm pure consciousness." And so that was enough. I think she was very intrigued with, who is this guy anyways? And so we ended up spending, like you said, we got to know each other through the course of the conference, spent some time together. And then we didn't see each other for a month because I was gone to New York for a week afterwards. And then I was sailing for 3 weeks up the coast of Canada. And, but as soon as I got back to Seattle, I flew right to San Francisco, and we had been talking on the phone every night for like 3 to 5 hours almost every night. So we got to really intimately know each other before we really had a physical, relationship. And once I reconnected with Shama, it was, I think, 10 weeks later that we were married. We got married in Venice, Italy.
If I remember, I think you were engaged within a month, maybe 5 weeks or something like that. And then didn't you get married that Thanksgiving? So like maybe 10 weeks later or something like that.
That's right. Yeah.
It was a little nutty at the time, but here we're 2.5 years later.
That's right. Yeah. And it's just incredible. Later in your life, as you age, I think you just become very clear about what you want. And Shama had gone through her own, soul searching and her divorce kind of around the same time as mine. And so she got really clear about what she wanted. And I'm a firm believer, Jon, that your soulmate exists. They are out there, and you don't have to do anything to find them.
That's cool. What a great story. Yeah, it's one I've told so many people that are involved in EO about that. So it's really cool to hear your side of the story. Jon, thank you so much for your time here today. Where can people go to learn more about you? And I know you and Shama actually launched a new business called Big Delta Capital, which is about the intersection of women and wealth, and you're producing some conferences that are coming up. So tell us a little about those.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Shama and I have co-founded a company, Big Delta Capital. We are working at the intersection of women and wealth. So the mission of this company is really to create curated networks for women, to have expansion opportunities and other networking with women, to have access to education, and then tangible opportunities to generate wealth. And then by taking that wealth and using capital to really change the world and create a vision of the world that women want to see. And so part of the pillars of this ecosystem are, we have 2 conferences, one on March 27th in the Presidio in San Francisco, and one on May 13th in New York. And you can find information about that at www.women.win. And you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Jon, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jon.
Thanks for listening to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast. This episode is powered by Rise 25. Please subscribe and check out future episodes.